So thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here to kick off this fascinating conference that represents so much excellent research in so many different areas. And I hope that the theme of my talk will reflect some of these interests and lead right into dinner in a way, or at least to some extent. Let me begin. The 6th International Youth Festival held in Moscow in 1957, in the summer of 1957, proved a watershed in opening the borders of the communist homeland. More than 34,000 young people from 131 countries converged on the Soviet capital, and for many commentators, Soviet life was never the same again, with sex and rock and roll high on the hit parade. Soviet restaurants welcomed these foreign guests by preparing the visitors' own foods during their stay. And this opening to world cuisines gained reinforcement through the appearance in Moscow of restaurants specializing in various national cuisines and in the promotion in the periodical press of new flavors. Now, at roughly the same time, 1955, Soviet citizens had begun to travel beyond their own borders in large numbers. The state licensed and encouraged this travel, sending increasing numbers of trade and cultural delegations abroad. And then Soviet citizens also embraced these new opportunities to explore unfamiliar cultures, compare experiences in other socialist countries with their own, and even for a privileged few, to observe and sample life in the capitalist West. In welcoming international youth and in sending citizens abroad, the Soviet regime announced its arrival on the world stage, no longer playing catch-up, but claiming a new position as the leader of a growing socialist and post-colonial world. This new role required a new Soviet mentality, a shift in the Soviet mentality. If the Stalin-era yardstick of Soviet identity was internal and ideological, Soviet citizens in the post-Stalin Cold War years needed to be knowledgeable about the world beyond their borders if they hoped to exercise leadership in world affairs. Venturing into the broader world as hosts and as guests, Soviets had to learn to engage, to understand, appreciate, and appropriate the cultures, practices, and the norms of a cosmopolitan world. Now, among these border-crossing practices were encountering new cultures of food and acknowledging the role that tastes play in determining modern national and individual identities. Both the everyday practices of food consumption and the particular makeup of a group's culinary repertoire contribute to a shared identity that is visceral and material, as well as symbolic. Soviet culinary historians have lately looked to the classic Soviet cookbook, the Book of Tasty and Healthy Food, for evidence of both standardization and of non-Russian contributions to the Soviet palate. And Soviet culinary traditions offer great potential for analyzing the identities produced through the materiality of taste. But I will argue that these identities are also mediated through the experience of travel and physical exchange. Now, much writing on Soviet food has understandably emphasized shortage and hunger, as you in this audience are quite aware. It has emphasized the economic and political problems the regime failed to solve or deliberately engineered. In late socialism, the skilled Soviet shopper knew always to carry a string bag in order to accommodate a surprise purchasing opportunity she might encounter in her daily routine. Heroic tales of shopping became part of the discourse of perestroika. Now, this paper seeks to redirect the conversation about food toward the possibility of choice, preference, taste, and personal growth. More specifically, this paper seeks to link travel and food consumption, looking at the role of tourism. By traveling abroad, some tourists came to define a particular Soviet cuisine as ours in opposition to the fare offered in their foreign tourist destinations, encouraging a more self-conscious and explicit notion of ours. And I'm focusing here in my longer research project on the long 1960s, as the transitional moment when the Soviet Union began to discover the world as well as the cosmos, and when it took consumption seriously, and when citizens and officials alike engaged in asserting a Soviet self on the world stage. I want to show how tourism and travel helped to break down borders by encouraging the consumption of alien foods, by propagandizing further inclusion in Soviet restaurants, cafes, and on home tables, and by exposing Soviet citizens to the culinary habits of visitors from abroad. Now, Soviet tourists were ambivalent about their encounters with abroad. They often expressed their wish for the familiar Moscow borscht to make them feel a little less far away from home. But at the same time, they recognized that encountering alien cultures and strange foods could also be invigorating and rewarding, a pathway to developing a more cosmopolitan Soviet self, one appropriate for aspiring leaders of the 20th century world. Now, we assume that the consumption of foods different from the familiar tastes of our childhood represents a choice to widen the boundaries and add a cosmopolitan persona to our primary sense of origin and place. Food philosopher Lisa Heldke emphasizes the high stakes of encounters with alien food. And I quote, "It feels much more risky to taste the food of an unfamiliar culture than to listen to its music, look at its art, or read its literature. And indeed, it is more risky. New flavors threaten or promise to challenge our boundaries as we either admit them onto our grocery lists or refuse them access." Now, most food scholars draw on the experience of capitalist countries, and one might wonder whether Soviet consumers, given the prevailing economy of shortages, would have the luxury to experiment with global tastes and therefore with cosmopolitan selves. The shortages were very real, and they hampered efforts to expand the Soviet palate at home. Yet the growing Soviet encounter with world cultures brought Soviet citizens into expanded contact with foods of other people and places in those other places. Did they welcome these encounters, or did they prefer to limit their consumption of foreign tastes to books, art, fashion, and rock and roll? So how did they encounter the tastes of others? Now, one approach to these questions is to consider whether there existed anything like a Soviet cuisine that provided a cultural boundary that could be traversed or defended. The Soviet Union celebrated its multinational form, and among its national traditions were the food cultures of more than 100 different ethnic groups. If we take the 1939 and 1952 editions of the Book of Tasty and Healthy Food as the codex of Soviet cuisine, then this tasty and healthy food reflected really a pan-European, or at least a East European culinary tradition, with the addition of recipes from Russian and Ukrainian peasant kitchens. And at first, only the exotic and spicy dishes of Georgia challenged the primacy of Slavic and Europeans cooking on the Soviet table. Georgian dishes had become standard luxury fare by the 1950s, inspired by the Moscow restaurant Aragvi, which opened in 1940 and was specially supplied by direct deliveries from the Georgian Republic. With the patronage of the Georgian-in-chief, Joseph Stalin, it became the place to see and be seen by an emerging power elite of the Soviet Union. The diffusion of those tastes, of those Georgian tastes, shows up in the accounts of Soviet domestic travel, although tastes changed slowly. According to health spa chefs who gathered at a 1950 conference, monotony in the vacationer's diet was due in part to vacationers' own limited tastes, rather than the inability of the kitchen staff to imagine expanded menus. A couple of chefs from Azerbaijan pointed to the conservatism of Russian diners, their unwillingness to sample the so-called Eastern dishes like plov and shashlik. "We get Russians here who've never eaten foods of the nationalities, and they're afraid to order them. We have to cajole them into trying them, to show them they're really not so bad." These professionals, these chefs, were imagining themselves as proselytizers for cosmopolitan eating even before the death of Stalin. Later, a proposal from several restaurant directors to the USSR Minister of Trade in 1957 insisted that the time is ripe to build a whole series of nationalities restaurants in the capital, Moscow. They envisioned a few large restaurants with a single kitchen and separate dining rooms for each related republic. Thus, the Transcaucasus restaurant would serve diners in the Georgian, Armenian, or Azerbaijan rooms. The Central Asia restaurant would feature dining rooms serving food from and decorated in the style of the Uzbek, Turkmen, and Tajik republics. Russia, of course, would have its own restaurant dedicated to Russian cuisine. Vicarious travel helped too, with cookbooks appearing as supplemental travel guides. An Armenian cookbook appeared in 1960, followed by a collection of the recipes of the peoples of the North Caucasus in 1963. And the output of cookbooks continued to grow in the later 1960s, although the cuisines of the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Ukraine received the most attention. In 1978, the eminent Soviet food writer William Patyotkin published the first edition of his encyclopedic, The National Cuisines of Our Peoples, with sections for each of the titular republics, beginning with Russia, of course, and even including sections for the foods of the small peoples of the North Caucasus, of Mongolia, and of Jews. The appearance of this cookbook marked a culmination of the trend that had begun already in the 1950s. By the 1960s, the pages of the monthly journal of the Public Catering Administration, aptly titled Public Catering, or Общественное питание, regularly offered instructions on preparing dishes from the Soviet Union's national regions for its audience of professional cooks and catering employees in their own kitchens. And I'm going to return to an analysis of these dishes in a few moments. So normative Soviet culinary production now married Russian cuisine and its century-old traditions with the spiciness and exoticism of food from the other 14 Soviet republics. Influenced by a growing array of multinational cookbooks and by their dining out experience, Soviet diners would be equally at home preparing the traditional fish in aspic for their New Year's celebration, or Georgian shashlik on their cookouts, or offering Uzbek plov and sweet Kazakh honey and walnut chak-chak to their families and guests. And all of these foods I myself was served in Soviet homes in the course of the 1970s. And once they had incorporated the diverse flavors of an expanded home into their culinary repertory, they could be more confident in confronting the even more exotic flavors of abroad. Now, in the aftermath of the 1957 International Youth Festival, Moscow's restaurant officials built on the success of the Aragvi by opening a string of international restaurants in the capital. Venturing into the promotion of cuisines of fraternal socialist countries, the Praga reopened in 1955, and the Peking began serving Muscovites in 1959. The Bulgarian restaurant Sofia had its debut in 1957, decorated with Bulgarian folk motifs and featuring a specially imported half-ton grill to prepare such specialties as kebabs, shashlik, and chicken. They served unusual soups and stews as well as grilled meats, along with tasty Bulgarian wine. And the assortment. As one fan wrote, this Bulgarian restaurant changes their menu every day to meet the demand of its patrons. By the early 1970s, Muscovites could also theoretically sample the cuisines of Hungary at the Budapest, Germany at the Berlin, Romania at the Bucharest, Cuba at the Havana, and Poland in the Warsaw. Such restaurants could become traveling spaces, arenas for the exploration of the culinary other. It's true that many of these restaurants were operated mainly for foreign tourists through the Intourist Agency, and as tourist travel to the Soviet Union expanded, Soviet chefs were encouraged to learn how to prepare meals that would make these tourists feel more at home. A lengthy series in Public Catering in 1963 explained the peculiarities of foreign cuisines in some detail. Koreans and Chinese do not much like dairy products, they said. The Germans like chopped meat, the Romanians do not. The English do not eat sausage or frankfurters. South Americans like their meat very rare, and coffee is their national drink. Now, these lessons in international cuisine were also applied to cooking at ordinary restaurants and cafes, and the pages of Public Catering included a stream of recipes from foreign countries for local cooks to prepare. Now, what explains this proliferation of new and unusual recipes? The Soviet consumer's entitlement to assortment and choice had been a mantra of economic planners and producers since the 1930s, as Yuka Gronow has written in his book Caviar and Champagne. In developing products of mass consumption, from candy to perfume, he said variety was king. A modern socialist consumer was expected to express his or her individuality through purchasing choices, and this required the provision of an adequate assortment of goods to buy. This drive for variety also dominated planning for restaurants and stolovayas in the post-Stalin years. The more items on the menu, the more prestigious the eating establishment. Now, how many of you have sampled those menus in Soviet times and only to find that of all the numerous items, nothing was on the menu? But they had to show the possibility. Moreover, the culture of dining had become yet another element in the Soviet project of producing cultured individuals, along with collective outings to the theater or museums, or group visits group visits to restaurants qualified as cultural work. In 1960, the Moscow Public Catering Authority ordered its city restaurants to organize Sunday afternoon tastings of national dishes. So workers at the Hammer and Sickle plant had a close relationship with the Ukraina restaurant, coming en masse with their families on their Sundays off. The Budapest restaurant also catered to factory groups, offering printed recipes to accompany their tasting menu, along with an orchestra and concert soloists for the entertainment of the families. All of this served to aid the Soviet cosmopolitan project of learning to be at home in the world as befitting a world leader. It is well known, claimed the chairman of the Trade Union of Sales and Catering Workers in 1958, that the economic competition of two world systems, capitalism and socialism, takes place in all spheres. This requires relentless improvement of socialist trade, the creation of more advanced organizational forms and methods of trade in comparison with the modern forms in capitalist countries. Now, during these same years of the early 1960s, the increasing flow of Soviet tourists abroad also contributed to new sensitivities to foreign cuisine, and their accounts provide unique access to actual eating experience. If cookbooks in the catering industry told the Soviet people what they ought to eat, travel abroad enabled and required Soviet citizens to ingest new flavors and to reflect upon the experience. Now, budgetary and political limitations meant most tourists ventured to countries of the communist bloc. Bulgaria proved to be a particularly popular halfway house to foreign flavors. Tour groups in 1965 praised the tasty and varied meals, which featured fresh fruits and vegetables, along with a daily packet of cigarettes for smokers and chocolates for the others. Bulgarian cuisine can satisfy even Russians, reported one group leader in 1969, although they would have liked to have the occasional pleasant surprise of Russian shy or Ukrainian borscht. Hungary's distinctive cuisine also attracted Soviet praise. A Moscow restaurant director visited there in 1958 and regaled his public catering office with his description of Budapest restaurants. Hungarian hospitality, the folk designs of its historic restaurants, and its piquant foods all contributed to the sense of amazement and wonder. Delegates to an international conference of food industry workers in the German Democratic Republic raved about the newly opened Budapest restaurant in Berlin with its Hungarian chefs and Hungarian musicians. You can totally believe you're in Hungary, they said. Travel accounts by the food professionals published in the journal Public Catering, not surprisingly, paid special attention to food. And trips to Western Europe in the late 1950s provoked particular expressions of wonder. Traveling with his group to Athens, Naples, and Paris, one writer gave extensive reports on the menu served in a modest restaurant near Athens and on the macaroni in Naples. Soviet food specialists fortunate enough to visit the World's Exhibition in Brussels in 1958 also praised Belgium's distinctive coffee, its many varieties of beer, and its fried potatoes. Sharing their own experiences abroad, such correspondence helped to broaden the horizons of professional food preparers inside the Soviet Union. But back home, there was also reluctance, resistance to expanding the culinary horizons of Soviet citizens, both on the part of consumers and also from professionals in the restaurant industry. Some Russians didn't eat lamb, whether they were in Soviet Georgia or sunny Greece. After some hopeful beginnings, the Moscow Culinary Council acknowledged that restaurants were serving fewer and fewer national foods. The Ukraina restaurants served no Ukrainian foods, and no Romanian dishes were to be had in the Bucharest restaurant. These officials blamed problems in supply. No goose liver or red peppers for Hungarian dishes. Even the aragvi, with its direct line of supply from Georgia, could not count on the availability of walnuts, the basis of so many notable Georgian recipes. Foreign correspondents blamed the lack of experts. There were no Chinese chefs at the Peking and no Hungarians at the Budapest. And even this limited opening to foreign cuisines had already produced a backlash from defenders of Russian national cuisine. Writing in the popular weekly Ogonyok, a celebrity entertainer lamented the disappearance of traditional Russian foods and local specialties. It was all well and good to sample the cuisines of different places different peoples at places like the Peking in the Aragvi, he wrote, but when foreigners came to Moscow, they were looking for real Russian food. Why did the restaurant Moskva serve nothing from traditional Moscow cooking? Why did you get the same loaf of white bread at every restaurant or cafe? He admonished Moscow chefs to restore the old Russian traditions of kulabyak with mushrooms, fish, and sturgeon marrow, and all the varieties of kasha and honey. Another newspaper echoed this nostalgia for Russian recipes. Moscow used to be celebrated for the variety of its pies, stuffed with meat, or cabbage, or mushrooms, or fish, berries, onions, or eggs. Where were the hot bubliki of yore? In the familiar linkage of Soviet scientific modernity and consumer utopia, the writer insisted that the people who have conquered the cosmos, built hydro stations, and conquered the virgin soils of Kazakhstan deserve more than the standard loaf of bread. Give them pies, he said. Now, the food historian Adrian Jacobs has argued that an emphasis on Russian cuisine need not represent a reaction to cosmopolitanism, but a refinement of it, a celebration of one of the culinary traditions that made up Soviet identity. Soviet diners could consume a multinational menu, conscious of the constituent parts of their culinary repertoire, and confidently stake their claim to knowledge of their world, at ease within the culinary boundaries of the Soviet Union. And conversely, Soviet cooks who catered to an international market became increasingly confident of their own place in world cuisine, recognizing that the foreign tourists who visited the Soviet Union came not only to admire architectural wonders and to attend world-class ballet performances, but to experience Soviet culture with all their senses, dining on Siberian pelmeni and Uzbek plov. Now, such anecdotal evidence testifies to the presence of world cuisines on the Soviet table. And to test a hypothesis of an ever-expanding saturation of foreign dishes proposed for the Soviet diet, I constructed a database of recipes published in Public Catering from 1958 to 1973. In each monthly issue, there was 2 regular columns of recipes. One was labeled Advice to the Cooks, and the other was For the Housewife, and later relabeled For the Home Table. Now, the number of recipes in each of these columns varied each month and each year, and there tended to be fewer over time. So there were a total of 218 different recipes in 1958 and only 46 in 1970. And most recipes carried no geographic or ethnic identifications or distinctions, and their names were overwhelmingly descriptive, which might be familiar to you from Soviet Stolovayas, such as potato soup with mushrooms, or salad of fresh cucumber. So I charted the frequency of recipes marked first as coming from non-Russian or Soviet parts of the Soviet Union, and second, recipes coming from abroad, and then finally, recipes clearly marked as Russian. And an example of that was beef stroganoff, which was the most common Russian food for which recipes were provided. Now, as this figure shows, so the top line is the Soviet, and the bottom black line is the Russian, and the real foreign recipes are the dotted blue line in the middle. There's considerable variation from year to year, but recipes from Soviet others often comprise between 1/4 and 1/3 of the total for a given year. I cut off the graph at 40%. It goes up to 100, and all those are the unmarked recipes, the potato soup with mushrooms. So Soviet others were between 1/4 and 1/3. Georgian recipes were indeed the most frequent, appearing 55 times in 16 years, followed by recipes from Ukraine and Belarusia with 39 recipes from each. Recipes from the real abroad rarely exceeded 10% of the total, and in some years there were none at all in these 2 columns, although there were other articles in the journal that talked about foreign cuisines. When it comes to non-Soviet recipes, Poland topped the league table with 30 recipes, followed by Bulgaria with 26. Non-socialist foods almost never appeared in these columns. And explicitly Russian recipes rarely exceeded 5% for most of the 1960s, although of course the default identity of potato soup with mushrooms was presumably Russian. Now, if we combine Soviet and foreign recipes over this period, it appears that the attention paid to these foods grew in the first half of the 1960s, kind of the middle of the bottom axis, grew in the first half of the 1960s, peaking in 1964, and then declined. And the drop was particularly notable after 1968. In the 1969 issues of the journal, the share of Russian recipes was higher than either Soviet or foreign recipes. One might wonder if this is a reaction to Czechoslovakia, but the variation is too high and the frequency too low to make definitive interpretations of these trends. But it's clear that the demand for cosmopolitan variety, for the taste of others, was surely stimulated by the continual expansion of Soviet tourism abroad. They traveled, they saw, and they dined. If between the first 10 years of Soviet travel, from 1955 to 1964, a total of 500,000 Soviet citizens ventured abroad for that whole period of 10 years, then in 1970 alone, 1.8 million tourists traveled to other countries, and 800,000 of these to countries of the capitalist West. In 1976, a total of 2.6 million Soviet citizens traveled abroad. So why did the interest in foreign recipes appear to flag after the middle of the 1960s, even at the time foreign travel was continuing to expand? Perhaps other sources, such as cookbooks or other journals, satisfied these tourists' desires to prepare at home the food they experienced abroad. The decrease in the number of specific recipes and the rise of essays on techniques might speak to a parallel growth in cookbook publishing, or the growing sophistication of Soviet professional cooks who didn't need to be reminded to look for foreign recipes anymore. Or perhaps the novelty of foreign tastes wore off. It's also true that the early years of the 1960s coincided with a massive gap between the promises of abundance and real shortages in food supply, particularly shortages of meat. Perhaps the proliferation of proposed international foods in public catering was a smokescreen to obscure those serious deficits, although the dozens of everyday vegetable dishes that were published was clear enough acknowledgement of the prevailing shortages of meat. We might also wonder whether the cohort of mass Soviet tourists who were less adventurous about foreign foodways than the pioneers of the late 1950s and early 1960s. To the extent that this last explanation holds true, then we might conclude that for some travelers, foreign journeys reaffirmed borders rather than to open them. Russian borscht would always taste better than minestrone, but it was significant and cosmopolitan to be able to make that comparison. In any event, it was not only cuisine that they experienced abroad. As much or even more, Soviet tourists and official travelers admired the organization of the foreign dining experience. Capitalist know-how had become a valued and respected import even under Stalin. Soviet Minister of Trade Anastas Mikoyan famously toured the United States in 1936, returning with the technology to produce ice cream and hamburgers. Travelers in the 1960s also admired and coveted the technology they encountered abroad, espresso machines, for example. But even more, they enthused about the simplicity, the variety, accessibility, pleasure, and service everywhere they went. Now, restaurant professionals readily acknowledged the low level of service that prevailed in Soviet restaurants and stolovayas. Reports were endemic of waiters who refused to wait on tables, who dressed slovenly, who drank on the job, and who shortchanged their customers. Although disgruntled patrons were entitled to record their criticisms in the obligatory complaint book, these volumes were frequently locked up in the director's office, and waiters resist furnishing them when asked because the consequences for even one negative report could be quite serious, as symbolized by this cartoon from the humor magazine Crocodile, which is how to grow decorative plants is the caption. One comment that did manage to be recorded in a comment book at the restaurant Praga nicely summarizes the Soviet dining experience of the 1960s. And again, those of you who traveled to the Soviet Union will find this very familiar at whatever time you went. This group had an hour and a half to kill before going to the cinema, so they decided to stop by the Praga to sample some Czech food. They ordered from a sullen waiter, but after an hour and 20 minutes, he had managed to serve them only mineral water and bouillon, even though the dining room was nearly empty. Their attempts to summon a waiter or maitre d' came up against a wall of indifference and apathy, they wrote. There was a group of waiters standing by the mirror, smiling politely at them, but they didn't budge to come to their service. And the diners also failed to locate their waiter in the kitchen when they went to find him there. Finally needing to leave for the cinema, they asked a senior waiter for the bill, and only now did they receive the shashlik and chicken tubaka, Georgian food, not Czech, the meal that they had ordered, and for which they'd paid 9 rubles, but had no time to consume. And so our good mood was ruined, they said. And this, unfortunately, was a common experience, acknowledged restaurant officials. So you can imagine their amazement when travel abroad exposed them to a radically different style of service. Virtually every report of travel to Eastern or Western Europe that appeared in the journal Public Catering marveled at the sidewalk cafes they encountered. And this is Athens in 1958. Tables right on the sidewalk in Athens, Paris, and Brussels, but also in Prague, Budapest, and Ljubljana. There were so many places to stop in and grab a bite, to read the newspaper, drink a cup of coffee without fuss. Many places were so informal, commented writers, they didn't even have a separate coat check room, but rather patrons hung their coats and hooks right next to their tables. Whereas in the Soviet Union, the term restaurant was reserved for the largest, most formal, most expensive dining establishments, in Belgium, any little cafe could call itself a restaurant. Writers praised these small spaces for their welcoming atmosphere, their populous feel, and their ubiquity. In Hungary, there was a network of espresso bars, which drew praise for their accessibility, convenience, and price. Writers also commented frequently on the simplicity of foreign table settings. Unlike Soviet restaurants, in which every table was loaded with china, 5 to 7 different types of crystal, and ornate utensils, restaurants abroad were typically set only with a tablecloth, ashtray, and salt and pepper. Everything else was brought once the patron had been seated. And in many places, they used plastic dishes and simple glassware. And the entire effect lent an air of spontaneity and vivacity missing in these ponderous Soviet establishments. Soviet commentators also remarked repeatedly on the unique and distinctive identities of cafes and restaurants abroad, and they recommended that this be emulated by Soviet eating establishments. These visitors were impressed by the use of national motifs, paintings, embroidered tablecloths, and hand-painted pottery in restaurants in Hungary, in Bulgaria, and in Japan. Such unique, individually designed places sharply contrasted with the mass-produced Soviet stolovayas with their standard layouts, cuisines, and accessories. The Soviet travelers found new sources of pleasure in their experiences in eating abroad, not the food necessarily, but in the whole space around them. The level of service they encountered abroad drew particular praise. Waiters in Belgium, with their uniform black tuxedos, were cultured, polite, and quick. In all the restaurants of Budapest, wrote another traveler, you're struck by the affability of the waiters, their attention and interest in their customers. When he comes to take your order, he always greets you first, and when he presents the bill, he wishes you well and invites you to come back again. They were also efficient and engaged. In one Yugoslav restaurant, you didn't see them hanging around a table or propping up the wall. They were few, but they were always at your service. And a veteran maitre d' reported on his 6-month assignment in a Soviet restaurant at the 1967 Montreal Expo at the Soviet Pavilion. He had worked in the Hotel Moskva for 11 years, an establishment generally considered to be one of the top Moscow restaurants. But after his service in Canada, he said, the scales fell from my eyes. It was impossible for the maitre d' to greet and seat every guest. Possible for a skilled waiter to clear 10 to 15 plates at a time. And these writers began to discuss the material incentives that produced this difference, and whether tipping, which was seen to be anathema in Soviet culture, was actually a useful contributor to consumer satisfaction. And that's the subject for another paper. So Cosmopolitan resided not only in foreign flavors, but in the entire performance of the meal, from the setting to service to the bill. Now, the development of the international itineraries after 1955, via cruise ships, Eastern European cityscapes, Black Sea resorts, and Georgian hospitality worked to transform Soviet citizens. By the 1960s, they were cordially invited to become citizens of the world, and many accepted the offer. Whether real or vicarious travelers, Soviet citizens gained the opportunity to redefine themselves as modern cosmopolitans, and the exotic flavors of international cuisines reinforced the new permeability of these borders that encouraged experimentation and adventure. How then to explain the historic turn back to Russian foods, the decline of foreign and Soviet ethnic recipes in the pages of public catering, and the disappearance of national dishes from the kitchens of the Budapest and the Warsaw? There were surely logistical reasons. The inability to secure the ingredients required for these foods has already been noted. Or perhaps the thrill of the new, so palpable with the opening of the borders in the late 1950s, had begun to lapse, and Soviet diners returned to the familiar foods of their youth. Perhaps having established their cosmopolitan bona fides, Soviet cooks and diners could reassert their traditional preferences from a position of leadership, not inferiority. After all, as they emphasized, Japanese tourists didn't come to Moscow for sushi, they wanted borscht. And the most popular restaurant at the Brussels World's Fair of 1958, beating out 70 other countries for the Grand Prix, was that of the Soviet Pavilion. Incidentally, the chef was a Georgian. So travel had established Soviet cuisine as a world cuisine too. So in the end, based on many prescriptions for cosmopolitan cooking and on some responses about eating abroad from travelers, we cannot be certain that eating the food of others necessarily meant changing one's identity. We know that given the miserly budgets of Soviet tourists abroad, they were more likely to choose to purchase things than tastes, that a satisfying foreign experience could consist solely of sipping a coffee at a sidewalk cafe in view of the Church of the Madeleine in Paris. But we also know that Soviet tourists did not seek foreign travel just because the regime told them to become cosmopolitan. They were ready, and they had been prepared by their own aspirations as well as the regime's desires to encounter the world beyond Soviet borders. Thus, in stretching their palates, Soviet travelers and those who stayed home may also have expanded their sense of self, learning to welcome the possibility and ability to slip back and forth across geopolitical borders, as well as culinary borders. They became equally at home in an informal cafe or a plush restaurant, in Sochi's Old Mill or in Makhachkala's Kafkaz, which is shown here in the slide. They understood their right to service, even if Soviet waiters did not. And if they were what they ate, whether then by traveling or just by consuming the tastes of others, they became a little more of the world beyond Russia, beyond the Soviet Union. And that cosmopolitanism could make them more confident consumers at home as well as abroad. Thank you.